So this is going to sound completely insane, but I found out my girlfriend was secretly recording our fights and sending them to my boss. Like, not just casual arguments, but our most private, heated moments when we were both saying things we didn't mean. She had this whole folder on her phone with dozens of audio clips, and apparently she'd been forwarding the worst parts to my manager for months. I only discovered it because I noticed her phone was always face down during our arguments, which seemed weird. Turns out she was building some kind of case against me at work while pretending to be supportive at home. The whole thing nearly destroyed my career and definitely destroyed any trust one had left in relationships. I'm still dealing with the fallout, but I wanted to share this story because I never thought someone I loved could be this manipulative. So I'm James, 29, project manager at a mid-sized tech company. I'd been dating Sarah for about 2 years, and honestly, things seemed pretty solid between us. We lived together in this decent apartment downtown, split the bills, did the whole domestic thing. She worked in marketing at a different company, so we didn't have any workplace drama to deal with, or so I thought. My job was pretty demanding, lots of deadlines and client meetings, but I genuinely enjoyed the work. My boss, Mike, was one of those guys who seemed fair but could be really intense when projects weren't going well. The team respected him, and I thought I had a good working relationship with him. I'd been there for 3 years and was actually up for a promotion to senior project manager. Sarah and I had the usual relationship stuff, you know? Sometimes we'd argue about chores or money, or whose turn it was to deal with her crazy landlord. Nothing major, just normal couple disagreements. She was usually pretty understanding about my work stress, and I tried to be supportive of her career goals too. We talked about moving in together permanently, maybe getting engaged eventually. Looking back, there were probably signs I should have picked up on, but when you're in the middle of a relationship, you don't always see the red flags. She was always really interested in my work drama, asking lots of questions about my boss and coworkers. I thought she was just being a good girlfriend, you know? Turns out she had completely different motives for all those conversations. So this whole mess started on a Tuesday night after I got home from a particularly brutal day at work. We'd had this client presentation go sideways, and Mike had been on everyone's case about the quarterly numbers. I was exhausted and just wanted to order takeout and watch something mindless on Netflix. Sarah was already home when I walked in, which was unusual since she normally worked later than me. She seemed kind of wound up about something, pacing around the kitchen while I was trying to decompress. I asked her what was wrong, and she started going off about how I never helped with household stuff and how she felt like she was doing everything. I was honestly confused because I thought we had a pretty fair division of labor, but I was too tired to really engage. I told her we could talk about it later, and that just made her more angry. She started listing all these specific examples of times I'd apparently let her down, and I found myself getting defensive. The argument escalated pretty quickly from there. I was saying things about how I worked long hours to pay for half of everything, and she was accusing me of not caring about her feelings. We were both getting louder, which was weird because we usually didn't fight like that. Sarah was normally pretty conflict avoidant. At some point during the argument, I noticed her phone was sitting on the counter, face down, which struck me as odd. She usually kept it face up, and she'd glance at notifications constantly. But this time she seemed to be ignoring it completely, even though I could see the screen lighting up under it. I kept arguing, but part of my brain was fixated on that phone. Something about the way she'd positioned it seemed deliberate. When I moved closer to the kitchen island where it was sitting, she quickly stepped between me and the counter, which made me even more suspicious. The fight went on for maybe another 20 minutes, with both of us saying increasingly hurtful things. I called her dramatic. She called me selfish, the usual relationship fight stuff that you regret later. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her behavior. Finally, when we were both exhausted from yelling, Sarah stormed off to the bedroom. I stayed in the kitchen, and that's when I realized her phone was still there, face down. I could see it was still recording something, with a little red light visible around the edges. My stomach dropped. I picked up the phone and saw she had a voice recording app running. It had been going for 37 minutes, basically the entire duration of our fight. I stopped the recording and saw there were dozens of other audio files in the app, all with dates and times that corresponded to previous arguments we'd had. I felt sick. I scrolled through the files and realized she'd been recording our private fights for months. Some of the files had notes attached, or it was like she was documenting everything for some purpose I couldn't understand. When Sarah came back out to get water, She saw me holding her phone and immediately got defensive. She told me I had no right to look through her personal stuff and tried to grab it back. I asked her why she was recording our arguments, and she claimed it was for her own emotional processing, like a diary. But something about her explanation didn't sit right with me. The way she'd hidden the recording, the detailed notes, the systematic nature of it all. It felt less like personal reflection and more like she was building a case file. The next morning, I couldn't concentrate on anything at work. I kept thinking about those recordings and trying to figure out what Sarah's real motivation could be. She'd left for work before I woke up, which was also unusual, and we hadn't talked about the phone situation at all. I was sitting in my cubicle, pretending to review project timelines, when Mike walked over and asked if he could speak with me privately. My heart immediately started racing because of everything that had happened the night before, but I tried to act normal. We went into his office, and he closed the door, which was never a good sign. Mike sat down behind his desk and gave me this look that I couldn't quite read. He asked me how things were going at home, which was a weird question since he'd never shown any interest in my personal life before. I told him everything was fine, but he kept pressing. He mentioned that he'd heard I might be dealing with some stress outside of work, and he wanted to make sure it wasn't affecting my performance. I asked him where he'd heard that, and he got kind of vague, saying something about how word gets around. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He told me that he understood relationships could be challenging, especially when there were disagreements about financial responsibilities and household duties. Those were almost the exact phrases Sarah and I had used in our fight the night before. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was freaking out. There was no way Mike could know those specific details unless someone had told him. And the only person who could have told him was Sarah, probably using those recordings. Mike kept talking about work-life balance and managing stress, but I could barely focus on what he was saying. I kept thinking about all those audio files on Sarah's phone and wondering how much of our private conversations she'd shared with my boss. After the meeting, I went back to my desk and tried to piece together the timeline. Sarah had been recording our fights for months, and now Mike was referencing specific details from those arguments. It seemed impossible, but I couldn't think of any other explanation. I spent the rest of the morning trying to figure out how Sarah would even have Mike's contact information. Then I remembered that her company had done some marketing work for our firm about a year ago. She'd mentioned meeting some of our management team during that project, including Mike. During lunch, I decided to do some investigating. I went back to Mike's office and asked if I could use his computer to pull up some old project files. While he was distracted with a phone call, I quickly checked his email. I scrolled through his recent messages and found what I was looking for. There were several emails from Sarah's personal account, all sent in the past few months. The subject lines were things like, "and." I couldn't open the emails without him noticing, but I could see they all had audio file attachments. My hands were shaking as I realized the scope of what Sarah had been doing. She wasn't just recording our fights for her own purposes. She was systematically documenting them and sending them to my boss, probably trying to sabotage my career. I managed to take a quick photo of the email list with my phone before Mike finished his call. When he turned back around, I pretended I was still looking for the project files, but my mind was racing with questions about what Sarah's endgame could possibly be. The rest of the day was a blur. I kept catching Mike looking at me strangely, and I wondered how much of our private life he'd heard through those recordings. Every interaction felt loaded with subtext, like he was evaluating me based on how I acted during our most intimate arguments. By the time I left work, I was convinced that Sarah had been deliberately sabotaging me for months. But I still couldn't understand why she would do something so calculating and cruel to someone she claimed to love. I spent the entire drive home trying to figure out how to confront Sarah about what I'd discovered. Part of me wanted to just come right out and ask her about the emails to Mike, but I also knew she'd probably just deny everything and make me feel crazy for suspecting her. When I got to the apartment, Sarah was already there making dinner, acting completely normal. She asked me about my day and seemed genuinely interested in my response, which made the whole situation feel even more surreal. How could she be standing there acting like a caring girlfriend when she'd been systematically destroying my professional reputation? I decided to start indirect and see how she reacted. I mentioned that Mike had pulled me aside for a weird conversation about my personal life, and I watched her face carefully for any signs of guilt or recognition. But she just looked concerned and asked what he'd said. I told her about Mike's comments regarding stress at home and relationship disagreements, and she frowned like she was trying to understand why my boss would know those details. Her acting was actually pretty convincing, which made me doubt myself for a moment. Then I brought up the recordings from the night before and asked her to explain why she'd been documenting our arguments. Sarah got defensive immediately and told me I was being paranoid. She insisted that the recordings were just for her own emotional processing, like she'd said before. But when I pressed her on why she needed to record me without my knowledge, she started getting angry. She accused me of not trusting her and said I was being controlling by questioning her coping mechanisms. She turned the whole conversation around so that I was the one who seemed unreasonable for being upset about the secret recordings. I found myself apologizing for looking through her phone, even though I knew I had every right to be concerned. Sarah was really good at making me feel guilty for questioning her, and she kept emphasizing how hurt she was that I didn't trust her. We went to bed that night without really resolving anything, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those emails I'd seen on Mike's computer and wondering what other evidence Sarah might have been collecting. Around 2 in the morning, I decided to do some more investigating. I waited until Sarah was definitely asleep. Then I carefully got out of bed and went to the living room where she kept her laptop. I knew her password because we'd always been open about that stuff, back when I thought we had an honest relationship. I opened her email and started scrolling through her sent messages. What I found was even worse than I'd imagined. There were dozens of emails to Mike over the past 4 months, all containing audio files from our arguments. But there were also draft emails that she hadn't sent yet, including one that was addressed to our HR department. The draft email was titled, and it contained several audio attachments along with a detailed complaint about my allegedly aggressive behavior at home. Sarah had written that she was concerned about my mental state and whether I might pose a risk to my coworkers. Reading that draft email felt like being punched in the stomach. Sarah wasn't just trying to get me in trouble with my boss. She was building a case to have me fired and possibly blacklisted in my industry. The email made it sound like I was some kind of dangerous person who couldn't control his temper. I took screenshots of everything I could find, including the draft email and the sent messages to Mike. I also noticed that Sarah had been researching workplace harassment policies and had bookmarked several articles about documenting domestic disputes. As I was closing the laptop, I heard movement from the bedroom. I quickly shut everything down and pretended to be getting water from the kitchen. Sarah appeared a few minutes later, asking if I was okay. I told her I couldn't sleep and was just getting a drink. She seemed suspicious and asked if I'd been using her computer. I lied and said no, but I could tell she didn't believe me. She went back to bed, but I heard her moving around for a while, probably checking to see if I'd accessed anything. The next morning, Sarah was cold and distant. She left for work without saying goodbye, and I realized that our relationship had crossed some kind of point of no return. Even if I confronted her with the evidence, I wasn't sure there was any way to rebuild trust after discovering such a systematic betrayal. I decided to take a different approach and see if I could get Sarah to reveal her motivations without directly accusing her. When she got home from work that evening, I suggested we talk about our relationship and try to work through some of our communication issues. Sarah seemed surprised but pleased that I wanted to have a serious conversation. She sat down on the couch next to me and took my hand, which made me feel sick knowing what she'd been doing behind my back. But I forced myself to act normal and see what I could learn. I started by apologizing for some of the things I'd said during our recent fights and acknowledged that I'd been stressed about work. Sarah nodded sympathetically and told me she understood that my job was demanding. She seemed genuinely caring, which made her betrayal feel even more twisted. Then I mentioned that I was worried about my relationship with Mike and wondered if he'd heard anything negative about me from outside sources. I watched Sarah's face carefully, but she just looked confused and asked what I meant. I explained that Mike had made some comments that suggested he knew details about my personal life, and I couldn't figure out how he would have that information. Sarah frowned and said that was strange, but she didn't seem nervous or guilty at all. She actually started offering theories about how Mike might have learned personal details about me. Maybe someone at work had overheard a phone conversation, or perhaps I'd mentioned something during a casual conversation that I'd forgotten about. Her suggestions sounded reasonable, and she seemed genuinely concerned about my professional reputation. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that I'd been wrong about everything. Maybe the emails were some kind of misunderstanding, or maybe there was an innocent explanation for the recordings. Sarah was being so supportive and loving that it was hard to believe she could be capable of such calculated manipulation. But then she said something that made my suspicions come flooding back. She mentioned that she thought Mike might be looking for reasons to get rid of me because the company was probably facing budget cuts. She suggested that I should be extra careful about my behavior at work and make sure I didn't give him any ammunition to use against me. The way she said it felt like a warning, but also like advice from someone who knew exactly what kind of ammunition Mike already had. I realized that Sarah was probably trying to make me paranoid and self-conscious so that I would actually start behaving in ways that justified her complaints about me. I decided to test her reaction by bringing up the recordings again. I told her I'd been thinking about what she'd said about using them for emotional processing, and I asked if she'd be willing to delete them since they made me uncomfortable. Sarah's demeanor changed immediately. She got defensive and said that I had no right to ask her to delete her personal coping tools. She accused me of trying to control how she dealt with her emotions and said that my request proved I didn't respect her autonomy. The conversation escalated quickly from there. Sarah started bringing up specific examples of times I'd been unreasonable or hurtful, and I noticed she was speaking louder than necessary, almost like she was performing for an audience. I glanced around and saw that her phone was sitting on the coffee table, positioned so that it would pick up both of our voices clearly. I realized she was probably recording this conversation too, and that thought made me incredibly angry. I told her I felt like I was being manipulated and monitored, and she immediately turned that around to make it seem like I was being paranoid and controlling. By the end of the conversation, I felt completely gaslit. Sarah had managed to make me feel guilty for questioning her behavior while simultaneously gathering more evidence to use against me. I went to bed that night feeling like I was losing my mind. The next day at work, I decided to confide in my colleague Marcus, who I'd known for years and trusted completely. I told him about the strange conversation with Mike and asked if he'd heard any rumors about me around the office. Marcus looked uncomfortable and admitted that there had been some talk about my personal life recently. He said that Mike had mentioned to a few people that I might be dealing with some anger management issues at home, and that HR was keeping an eye on the situation. Hearing that confirmed my worst fears. Sarah's campaign against me was working, and my professional reputation was already being damaged by her recordings. I realized I needed to act quickly before the situation got completely out of hand. I spent the weekend trying to figure out my next move. I knew I had evidence of Sarah's emails and recordings, but I also realized that confronting her directly would probably just make her more careful about covering her tracks. I needed to understand the full scope of what she was doing before I could figure out how to protect myself. On Monday morning, I decided to have another conversation with Marcus to see what else he'd heard around the office. I asked him to be completely honest with me about any rumors or concerns that management might have about my performance or behavior. Marcus looked really uncomfortable, but he eventually told me that Mike had shared some audio clips with the senior management team during a meeting the previous week. He said the clips allegedly showed me being verbally aggressive and emotionally unstable during personal conversations. I felt sick hearing this confirmation that Sarah's recordings were being circulated among my colleagues and supervisors. Marcus assured me that he didn't believe the clips represented who I really was, but he warned me that some people in management were starting to question my fitness for the promotion I'd been hoping for. That afternoon, I made a decision that I knew was risky but felt necessary. I was going to start recording my own conversations with Sarah to document her manipulation and get evidence of her real motivations. I downloaded a recording app on my phone and decided to see if I could get her to admit what she was doing. When I got home that evening, Sarah was in an unusually good mood. She'd made my favorite dinner and seemed excited to tell me about her day. The contrast between her cheerful demeanor and what I knew she was doing behind my back was jarring. I started the recording app on my phone and casually brought up the topic of work stress again. I mentioned that I'd been feeling like some people at the office were treating me differently lately, and I wondered if she had any theories about why that might be happening. Sarah listened sympathetically and suggested that maybe I was being too sensitive or reading too much into normal workplace interactions. She said that sometimes when we're stressed, we can misinterpret other people's behavior and see problems that aren't really there. I pressed a little harder and said that I specifically felt like Mike had information about my personal life that he shouldn't have access to. I asked Sarah if she could think of any way that might have happened. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. It was subtle, but it looked like satisfaction or maybe even amusement. Then she composed herself and said she couldn't imagine how Mike would know personal details about me unless I'd shared them myself. I decided to be more direct and told her that I was starting to feel like someone was deliberately trying to sabotage my career. I said that the timing of Mike's concerns seemed suspicious, especially since they'd started around the same time that Sarah and I had been having more arguments. Sarah got defensive and asked if I was suggesting that she had something to do with my work problems. She accused me of being paranoid and said that it was hurtful for me to imply that she would ever try to harm my career. But then she said something that was clearly intended to provoke me. She told me that maybe my problems at work were a reflection of legitimate concerns about my behavior, and that I should consider whether there might be some truth to what people were saying about me. I felt my anger rising, which was exactly what she wanted. I realized that Sarah was trying to bait me into having an emotional reaction that she could record and use as evidence of my instability. The calculated nature of her manipulation was breathtaking. Instead of taking the bait, I forced myself to stay calm and asked her what she meant by that comment. I said that I was genuinely curious about her perspective on my behavior and whether she thought I had anger management issues. Sarah seemed frustrated that I wasn't getting upset. She started making more pointed comments about my temper and my tendency to blame other people for my problems. She was clearly trying to escalate the conversation into an argument, but I kept responding in a measured way. Finally, she seemed to realize that her usual tactics weren't working. She accused me of being cold and emotionally distant, and said that my refusal to engage with her concerns proved that I didn't care about our relationship. I ended the conversation by telling her that I needed some time to think about everything she'd said. I went to my office and stopped the recording, then listened back to what I'd captured. Sarah's attempts to manipulate and provoke me were clear when I heard them played back, and I finally had some evidence of her true behavior. I spent the next few days gathering more evidence and trying to build a complete picture of Sarah's campaign against me. I recorded several more conversations where she tried to provoke arguments, and I also took additional screenshots of her emails and research into workplace harassment policies. By Friday, I felt like I had enough evidence to confront her directly. I knew that she would probably deny everything and try to gaslight me, but I also hoped that having concrete proof might shock her into admitting what she'd been doing. When Sarah got home from work that evening, I was waiting in the living room with my laptop and phone ready. I told her that we needed to have a serious conversation about our relationship and the future. Sarah sat down across from me and asked what was wrong. She seemed genuinely concerned, which made what I was about to do feel even more surreal. I took a deep breath and told her that I knew about the recordings she'd been sending to Mike and the draft email she'd prepared for HR. Her face went completely white, and for a moment she just stared at me without saying anything. Then she started shaking her head and told me that I was wrong, that I was misunderstanding something, that there had to be some kind of explanation. I opened my laptop and showed her the screenshots I'd taken of her emails. I read aloud from the draft complaint she'd written about me, including the parts where she described me as potentially dangerous and unstable. Sarah's hands were shaking as she listened. She tried to deny that she'd written the emails, claiming that someone must have hacked her account or that I'd somehow fabricated the evidence. But when I showed her the timestamps and the detailed personal information that only she would know, her denials became less convincing. Finally, Sarah broke down and started crying. She told me that she'd been scared of my temper and had started recording our arguments because she wanted to have evidence if I ever became physically violent. She said that she'd only contacted Mike because she was worried about my mental state and thought he should know that I was dealing with stress at home. I almost felt sorry for her until I remembered all the times she'd deliberately provoked arguments and tried to escalate our disagreements. I told her that I'd been recording our recent conversations too, and that I had evidence of her manipulation tactics. Sarah's tears stopped immediately, and she asked what I meant by that. I played back one of the recordings from earlier in the week where she'd clearly been trying to bait me into an angry response. Her voice sounded calculating and cold when I played it back, completely different from the caring girlfriend persona she usually projected. She listened to the recording with a stunned expression, and I could see her trying to figure out how to explain away what was clearly manipulative behavior. Finally, she admitted that she'd been trying to document my reactions to stress because she thought it would help me get professional help for my anger issues. But then I played another recording where she'd explicitly tried to provoke me by making insulting comments about my character and my career prospects. In that clip, she sounded almost gleeful when she thought she was getting an emotional reaction from me. Sarah realized that her explanations weren't working, and her whole demeanor changed. She stopped crying and looked at me with what I can only describe as cold calculation. She told me that I had no right to record her without her consent and that doing so was probably illegal. I pointed out the irony of that complaint, given that she'd been secretly recording me for months. But Sarah just shrugged and said that she'd been protecting herself from what she perceived as threatening behavior, while I was just trying to entrap her. The conversation went on for another hour, with Sarah alternating between tearful apologies and defiant justifications for her actions. She never fully admitted that her goal had been to sabotage my career, but she also couldn't explain why she'd been researching workplace harassment policies or why she drafted such a damaging complaint to HR. By the end of the night, I realized that there was no point in trying to get a full confession from her. Sarah was never going to take responsibility for what she'd done, and she was probably already planning her next move to protect herself from the consequences of being exposed. Over the weekend, I had to make some difficult decisions about how to handle the situation at work. I knew that Sarah's recordings were already circulating among management, and I needed to get ahead of the narrative before it completely destroyed my career. On Monday morning, I requested a meeting with HR to discuss what I described as a personal situation that was affecting my work environment. I brought copies of all the evidence I'd gathered, including Sarah's emails to Mike and the recordings I'd made of her manipulative behavior. The HR director, Janet, seemed surprised when I explained the situation. She told me that they had indeed received some concerning reports about my behavior, but that they were still evaluating the information and hadn't made any formal decisions about how to proceed. I asked if I could hear the recordings that had been shared with management, and Janet reluctantly agreed to play a few clips. What I heard was even worse than I'd expected. The audio files had been edited to remove most of the context and make my responses sound as aggressive and unreasonable as possible. In one clip, you could hear me raising my voice and saying something about Sarah being dramatic, but you couldn't hear the 20 minutes of her deliberately provoking and insulting me that had led to that response. Another clip captured me using profanity during an argument, but it didn't include Sarah's equally harsh language or the fact that she'd been the one to escalate the conflict. I played Janet some of my own recordings that showed the full context of those same arguments. When she heard Sarah's manipulation tactics and deliberate provocations, her expression changed completely. She realized that the clips they'd received painted a very misleading picture of what had actually been happening. Janet asked me to leave all of my evidence with her so that HR could conduct a thorough review of the situation. She assured me that they would consider the full context of the recordings and that they wouldn't take any action based solely on the edited clips they'd initially received. I felt relieved to finally have the truth out in the open, but I also knew that the damage to my reputation had already been done. Even if HR cleared me of any wrongdoing, my colleagues had already heard rumors about my alleged anger issues and instability. When I got back to my desk, Mike called me into his office for another conversation. This time, he seemed less hostile and more confused. He told me that HR had briefed him on some new information about the recordings, and he wanted to get my side of the story. I explained the situation as clearly as I could, focusing on Sarah's systematic manipulation and the misleading nature of the edited clips. Mike listened carefully and admitted that he'd been concerned about the recordings, but that hearing the full context changed his perspective significantly. He apologized for jumping to conclusions and assured me that my job was not in jeopardy. He also promised to clarify the situation with the other managers who had heard the original recordings. I appreciated his willingness to reconsider, but I could tell that our working relationship had been damaged by the whole ordeal. The rest of the week was awkward as word spread around the office that the rumors about me had been based on false information. Some of my colleagues seemed embarrassed that they'd believed the worst about me, while others just seemed confused about what had really happened. I tried to focus on my work and act like everything was normal, but I felt like everyone was watching me and evaluating my behavior. The whole experience had made me incredibly self-conscious about how I interacted with people, and I found myself second-guessing every conversation. I thought the worst was over after HR cleared me and Mike apologized, but I underestimated how far Sarah was willing to go to protect herself. When I got home on Friday evening, she was already packing her things and preparing to move out. She told me that she couldn't stay in a relationship with someone who didn't trust her and who had violated her privacy by recording their conversations. She was acting like she was the victim in the situation, which was both infuriating and sadly predictable. I didn't try to stop her from leaving, but I did ask her to delete any remaining recordings she had of our private conversations. Sarah refused and said that she had every right to keep documentation of what she described as my abusive behavior. Over the weekend, I discovered just how vindictive Sarah could be when she felt cornered. She had posted several of the audio clips on social media, along with captions describing me as emotionally abusive and potentially dangerous. She tagged several of my friends and colleagues in the posts, ensuring that as many people as possible would see her version of events. The clips she posted were the same edited versions she'd sent to Mike, with all the context removed to make me sound as bad as possible. She also included photos of text messages where I'd apologized for things I'd said during arguments, which she presented as evidence that I knew my behavior was wrong. I was horrified to see our private relationship drama playing out on social media for everyone to see. Several of my friends reached out to ask if I was okay and to express concern about the allegations Sarah was making. I tried to explain the situation, but I knew that most people would only see Sarah's posts and not dig deeper into the truth. I contacted a lawyer to find out what options I had for getting the posts removed and preventing Sarah from sharing more recordings. The lawyer told me that the situation was complicated because the recordings had been made in our shared home, but that I might have grounds for a harassment claim if Sarah continued to post private content without my consent. Meanwhile, I decided to fight back by posting my own evidence on social media. I shared some of the recordings that showed Sarah's manipulation tactics, along with screenshots of her draft email to HR and her research into workplace harassment policies. I tried to present the information objectively and let people draw their own conclusions. The response was mixed. Some people who knew me well immediately recognized that Sarah's version of events didn't match my character, and they were supportive of my decision to share the full context. But others seemed to think that the whole situation was messy and that both of us were probably at fault. A few of my colleagues at work saw the social media drama and expressed concern about how it might affect my professional reputation. I assured them that HR had already reviewed all the evidence and cleared me of any wrongdoing. But I could tell that some people were still uncomfortable with the whole situation. By the end of the week, I realized that I needed to take a step back from social media and focus on rebuilding my life without Sarah. The public battle over our relationship was only making things worse for both of us, and I didn't want to give her any more ammunition to use against me. I deleted my posts about the situation and asked my friends to stop sharing or commenting on Sarah's allegations. I wanted to take the high road and let the truth speak for itself, rather than getting dragged into an ongoing public conflict. It's been about 6 months since Sarah moved out, and the whole recording scandal came to light. I'm still dealing with some of the professional and personal fallout from her campaign against me, but things have gradually gotten better. At work, my relationship with Mike and the rest of management has mostly returned to normal. I did end up getting the promotion I'd been hoping for, which felt like validation that my professional reputation had survived the ordeal. However, I'm still more cautious about sharing personal information with colleagues, and I think twice before expressing any strong emotions in the workplace. The hardest part has been learning to trust people again in my personal relationships. I've been on a few dates since Sarah and I broke up, but I find myself constantly analyzing people's behavior for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas. It's exhausting to always be on guard, and I know it's not fair to judge new people based on Sarah's actions. I've been seeing a therapist to work through some of the trust issues and emotional damage from the relationship. It's been helpful to have a neutral person validate that what Sarah did was genuinely manipulative and abusive, rather than a normal relationship conflict that got out of hand. The therapist has helped me recognize some of the warning signs I missed early in my relationship with Sarah. Her excessive interest in my work drama, her tendency to escalate minor disagreements, and her pattern of making me feel guilty for questioning her behavior were all red flags that I ignored because I wanted to believe she cared about me. I've also learned to set better boundaries in relationships and to trust my instincts when something feels off. If I ever find myself in a situation where someone is secretly recording me or trying to undermine my career, I'll address it immediately rather than giving them the benefit of the doubt. Some of my friends have asked if I regret not seeing Sarah's true nature earlier, but honestly, I think she was very good at hiding her manipulative tendencies. She presented herself as a caring, supportive partner while systematically documenting everything she could use against me later. The experience has made me more empathetic to other people who have been in emotionally abusive relationships. I understand now how easy it is to get gaslit and manipulated by someone you trust, and how difficult it can be to recognize the abuse while it's happening. I still have Sarah's contact information blocked on all my devices, and I've made it clear to mutual friends that I don't want any updates about her life. I need to focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on what she did to me. Epilogue. Looking back on everything that happened with Sarah, I'm grateful that I discovered her recordings when I did. If I hadn't noticed her phone that night during our argument, she might have succeeded in getting me fired or even blacklisted in my industry. The whole experience taught me valuable lessons about trust, boundaries, and recognizing manipulation in relationships. I'm still working on rebuilding my ability to be vulnerable with people, but I'm in a much healthier place now than I was during those months of being systematically undermined by someone I loved. My career has recovered, and I've learned to value relationships with people who are honest and direct rather than those who operate through deception and manipulation.